On the morning of Sunday, July 24th, 2016, the waters of Stony Cove in Leicestershire, England, looked calm. It was one of those quiet, breezy summer mornings, the kind that made it easy to forget just how unforgiving deep water could be. A group of 3 divers entered the water that day. Among them was Nigel Craig, a well-respected dive instructor with over 2 decades of experience. He was a seasoned professional, someone who had spent hundreds of hours in these very waters. And guiding him through this dive were 2 of his students. Richard Stansfield, a 40-year-old man working toward his deep diver certification, and another diver named Carol Tarzik, who would join them for this routine but critical training session. The goal? Simple on paper: execute a deep dive to 35 meters, perform a navigation task, check air consumption, manage buoyancy, and make a mandatory safety stop before surfacing. This was part of a deep diving specialty course, the kind of training that prepared divers for the increased risks of being deeper, longer, and further from help. It was standard for anyone serious about scuba. But what unfolded that day wouldn't just end with an incomplete certification. By the end of it, 1 diver would be dead, 1 instructor would be on trial for manslaughter, and the entire diving community would be forced to confront a rarely understood, life-threatening medical condition that no training at the time even touched. It all began with a plan that should have been safe. Stony Cove is no stranger to deep divers. It's a flooded quarry, long repurposed as a dive site, with shelves of descending depth that make it ideal for training. Beginners practice in the shallow zones, and advanced divers can push their limits in depths that reach 35 meters. There's even an old metal structure called the hyperbaric chamber, or hyperbox, which sits at the deepest point, used for both commercial and recreational training. Nigel Craig knew the quarry well. It was more than just a workplace to him. It was where he learned to dive himself back in 1996. He had practically grown up underwater here, navigating every ledge and slope of the quarry like a second home. So when Richard approached him to pursue his deep diving certification, the plan came together smoothly. Richard already had his advanced open water certification. That's not beginner-level diving. It means someone's had solid training and enough experience to understand the risks. The deep specialty course just builds on that. To earn the certification, Richard needed to complete 3 dives. 1 of them had already been done during his previous training. The second was scheduled for that Sunday morning. They geared up at the edge of the cove, unloading their equipment from the parking area, walking down a short path, past the railings, and onto the dive platform. After a safety briefing and equipment check, the trio began their surface swim, a 100-meter trek across calm waters to reach the descent line. At that point, everything was routine. Nothing about that day hinted at disaster. Once they reached the descent point, they waited a few minutes at the surface, allowing Richard to catch his breath. This wasn't unusual. It's important that every diver is comfortable before descending, and Richard signaled that he was ready. The regulators went in. The trio began their slow, steady drop into the depths. It took about 10 minutes to reach the bottom, slower than usual, mostly due to Richard having trouble with his buoyancy. He wasn't sinking smoothly. Instead, he was struggling to stay at depth, fighting against the natural tendency of his body to rise. This is a common issue for newer divers, and usually it can be corrected by adjusting weights or air in the buoyancy control device. At 32 meters, just above the hyperbox, they leveled off. Nigel conducted an air check. Richard, who had started the dive with a full 250-bar tank, now had just 150 bars remaining. That was a notable drop, but not alarming, not yet. After all, each diver had a backup 12-liter cylinder. Still, something about the air consumption bothered Nigel. He made a mental note to check again soon. Next came the navigation exercise. The task was designed to assess whether Richard could maintain direction, buoyancy, and composure while performing a technical skill at depth. But again, buoyancy was a problem. Richard kept floating upward, not quickly, more like a slow, frustrating drift that kept pulling him away from the group. Nigel decided to cut the first attempt short, reset, and try again. On the second try, Richard managed to stay level. He completed the navigation drill successfully. Nigel checked his air again. This time, Richard signaled 60 bars remaining. That number was concerning. A 90-bar drop in just a few minutes was far faster than expected. There was no sign of distress, but clearly Richard was burning through his air supply. Nigel made the call, end the dive, and begin a controlled ascent. Carol was asked to monitor Richard's air during the ascent. The group made their way up slowly. At 18 meters, Richard signaled he was out of air. That didn't make sense. Carol checked and saw 20 bars left in Richard's tank. His regulator was working. There was no rapid breathing, no panic. But Richard couldn't breathe. Nigel signaled for Richard to switch to Carol's alternate air source, the octopus. Richard made the switch. He gave the OK signal. For a moment, everything was under control again. Then it happened again. A few meters higher, Richard once again signaled out of air. But again, there was still pressure in the tank. The regulator worked. This time, Carol gave him her main regulator, and Richard accepted it. Again, he signaled OK. The group continued the ascent. When they reached 5 meters, Nigel made the decision to perform a standard 3-minute safety stop. Richard was calm, breathing, and had air. At least as far as they could tell, everything seemed stable. But just 2 minutes into the stop, Richard panicked. Without warning, he made a break for the surface. Nigel reacted quickly, grabbing Richard to prevent a rapid ascent. Surfacing too fast from depth can cause serious injury, decompression sickness, air embolisms, and more. Holding a diver back in those moments is standard training. But during the struggle, Richard's regulator was pulled from his mouth. Nigel tried to get it back in, but it was too late. Richard's eyes had already begun to glaze over. There was no longer any sign of consciousness. Carol was signaled to ascend immediately. Nigel followed with Richard seconds later. On the surface, rescue crews were called. A dive boat rushed over. Paramedics managed to resuscitate Richard, and he was transported to a nearby hospital. But 5 hours later, he was pronounced dead. In the immediate aftermath, Nigel and his wife tried to move on, as much as anyone can after something like that. The incident seemed like a tragic accident, a routine dive gone wrong. But then came the letter. September 2020, 4 years after the incident, Nigel Craig was charged with gross negligence manslaughter. The case would shake the UK dive community and trigger a courtroom battle that tested everything from air consumption charts to dive protocols, and ultimately medical science itself. Nigel had been trying to rebuild a quiet life with his wife when the envelope arrived on an otherwise ordinary morning. Inside was not just a formal notice, but a devastating accusation that he had been responsible for the death of his student. The language of the charge sheet was cold and clinical, but the implications were staggering. It meant that everything he had done that day, every decision underwater, every second of the ascent, would be pulled apart by lawyers, experts, and the media. For the first time since the tragedy, Nigel's name and face were splashed across headlines again, only now framed as the man on trial. Diving forums lit up with speculation, with some defending him as a scapegoat and others questioning the choices made during the safety stop. Former students and colleagues described him as meticulous and patient, while prosecutors painted him as someone who had valued procedure over a human life. In pubs, on dive boats, and in online groups, the conversation was relentless. Could an instructor really be guilty of manslaughter for following training protocols? Even before stepping into court, Nigel was living under the weight of public judgment. He began reliving the dive over and over in his mind at night, replaying every gesture, every signal, wondering if he could have done something differently. His legal team warned him that the case would hinge on whether the jury believed he had intentionally held Richard underwater against his will. That claim horrified Nigel, who knew how absurd it sounded, but also understood how persuasive a simple narrative could be to people unfamiliar with diving. The Crown's lawyers prepared diagrams, graphs, and excerpts from training manuals, trying to show that Nigel's decisions had been reckless rather than reasonable. They pointed to the moment at 5 meters, calling it the fatal pause, and argued that no prudent instructor would have delayed surfacing. Yet for every claim, diving experts prepared rebuttals, explaining nitrogen absorption, ascent rates, and why safety stops are not optional at depth. Behind the courtroom formality was a man whose entire career and livelihood were at stake, and a widow and family who still mourned Richard Stansfield's loss. The press called it a test case for British diving and said the verdict might change how every instructor in the country operated. What had begun as a day of training in a quiet quarry had now become a national conversation about risk, responsibility, and a medical phenomenon most jurors had never heard of. For Nigel, each day of testimony was another descent into that memory, a dive he could not surface from until the jury made its decision. The prosecution's case against Nigel Craig rested on one critical moment during the dive, the safety stop at 5 meters. They argued that Nigel had knowingly held his student underwater, choosing to prioritize a routine safety stop over a diver who had already signaled distress multiple times. The idea was that Nigel had, in their words, placed procedure above preservation, effectively watching his student drown while waiting out a 3-minute timer. It was a bold accusation, one that didn't just question Nigel's judgment, but his humanity. But it wasn't that simple. That's when a term began to surface, a condition that, at the time, was barely known in the diving world. Immersion pulmonary edema, or IPO, also known as swimming-induced pulmonary edema. This condition occurs when fluid begins to fill the lungs spontaneously during immersion in water. No trauma, no regulator failure. The body simply shuts down the ability to breathe, even when oxygen is available. The symptoms match what Richard experienced exactly. Out of breath, no air, regulator working, no panic, until the moment the lungs give up. At the time of Richard's death, IPO was still poorly understood and barely covered in dive training programs. Many divers, even experienced ones, had never heard of it. The scars remain. Not physical ones, but the kind that cling to memory, reputation, and regret. All because of a condition no one could see, until it was far too late. If you found this story gripping, be sure to check out more true, haunting real-life events like this on the channel. Subscribe, share, and help us bring light to stories that matter.